All righty. I'm going to kick it off. This is our monthly release recap for BloodHound. Um, as oh, that moving on its own, that's going to be fun. As usual, we've got both content around BloodHound specifically, and then we brought one of our other folks, Daniel Heinsen, to talk about some really cool stuff with Entra Connect. Excited to learn more about that because he's been doing some cool research into tradecraft with that particular technology. But I'll start out. My name's Stephen Hink. I lead product for BloodHound and BloodHound Enterprise. If folks are in the BloodHound Gang Slack, you'll see me dropping release notes every few weeks, responding to stuff. Daniel's one of our service architects on our consulting team and has been doing a bunch of research into Entra, as I mentioned. So we're going to talk about kind of what's changed over the month in BloodHound, excuse me, and then I'll hand it over to Daniel for the spotlight on the stuff that he's been digging into, and then if we have Q&A that's outside of those, we'll pick that up at the end. So this month was our first release of the year. For folks who remember or paying attention, we had a pretty big release at the end of last year in December. We had some big changes to how we measure severity in the enterprise product and how we report things. Excuse me. And a bunch of other stuff. And we were wrapping up a bunch of projects in there. So the last bits of those projects wrapped up and were shipped then. And we started new ones within our engineering team, which we're excited to talk about here in the coming months. This particular release, most of the features were focused around single sign-on, covering a lot of things that help a lot of our folks that we've gotten feedback around, making it easier to just kind of use that configuration or that capability. And then we also made some changes to the default tier 0. We talked a little bit about that, the expectation of doing so last time, but I wanted to go over it again. So within single sign-on, this is something that we include within both our enterprise and our free product within BloodHound CE for everybody. We feel this is an important thing to include to support, to allow folks to deploy our product in a secure manner. And so we include it within the free product with no additional charges associated with it. And we continue to make expansions to it and make that available to all of our users. Specifically, this particular release, we added support for just-in-time provisioning. This is an optional capability that will allow you to give the control to create new users to your identity provider. So for folks in particular at larger organizations, this will have a big impact. Previously, anybody that you wanted to let have access to a BloodHound environment, you would have to go into and manually create their user account and specify a role and give the the name and the email and all that good stuff. And then you could configure it to work with single sign-on from there. This gives you the optional ability on a single sign-on provider to automatically create those new users if they successfully complete a login flow. It lets you set their default role. So if you want every new user to come in with a read-only role, for example, you can do that. You can also have the single sign-on provider provide that role as part of its assertion to say, hey, create this new user with the administrator role, as an example. Again, this will make it a lot easier. It removes that need to manually create all those users. And it's an optional configuration. So if you don't want to do that, if you do want to manually control who has access, you absolutely still have that ability. Just make sure those checkboxes are disabled, which they will be by default. We've also made single sign-on providers updatable. This was particularly helpful for folks who use SAML as an example, where the certificate certificates matter a lot. And so if you ran into the case where a certificate expired, you would have to go through the process of creating a new provider and then migrating all of your users over to that. You can now go into an SSO provider and update it. So if a domain changed or certificate changed or something like that, you can go in, modify the settings for either OIDC or SAML, and everybody will start working with that new configuration. So some nice ease of management for your operations folks. And then finally, just making it easier for things like certificate pinning or using encrypted assertions. For SAML providers, we've added a download SP certificate link so that you can pull that down and upload it into your identity provider to make that easier to do things like encrypted assertions. The other changes we made was we removed some of the newly defaulted tier 0 objects from tier 0. Jonas talked about this on our last recap in December. The distributed comm users and performance log users group attack paths that existed to domain controllers were patched by Microsoft. It didn't initially look like that was going to be the case, but then the particular escalation path was resolved. As we don't track vulnerabilities from that perspective in BloodHound, we did remove those as default tier 0 objects. We also removed the DNS admins group from tier 0. For folks who are running Active Directory DNS, more than likely your DNS admins group is tier 0. But we found that a number of customers were not running Active Directory DNS and were using solutions from other providers. In that case, the DNS admins group does not have the tier 0 control, and so we remove that as a default. At some point, we have the desire to add the ability to add in defaults that can be disabled. So we could include something like DNS admins. We could enable it by default. And for the folks who are not using Active Directory DNS, for example, you could disable that particular selector. Those would not be tagged tier 0 or high value, and you would be able to go along your merry way. We did have a small release of SharpHound in the last release, specifically around a circumstance that a couple of our customers were running into, where SharpHound was attempting to connect to the same domain multiple times, even though it had received a failure. This resulted in some poor performance in those cases. And so we've resolved that to make sure that once we fail to connect to a domain, it won't reattempt and do that cycle over and over again. I'm going to come back to announcements later, but that's our release recap. Those are all the things that we covered in our last release in BloodHound. We've got more coming up. I'm really excited. There will be a release next week, and we'll be looking forward to talking about that. We generally release about every 3 weeks, so you can always expect to see something new here. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Daniel.
Sweet. All right. So I'm going to throw up a quick PowerPoint, and then we'll kind of just hop through some labs. So and for the record, so this stuff is not in BloodHound in any sense yet, but maybe hopefully someday it will be. So I'm going to go from here. Let me just share my screen. Very good. Okay. So what I've been looking at in the past couple of months is the kind of the mechanisms of how Entra Connect works. And if you're not familiar with Entra Connect, really the root of or the kind of the impetus for me even looking into Entra Connect is this question of within Entra tenant, an Entra tenant can have dozens and dozens and dozens of different separate domains, right? And in our engagements, we'll often see that like tenants have many unrelated domains, like if it's a large organization that has like multiple subsidiaries. And we wanted to know like if a compromise of one of those domains in the tenant could equal to a compromise of the entire tenant itself. And there's some reasons why we think this could be possible. And I want to start talking through like how some of this works, hopefully to maybe spark some curiosity, or at least maybe get you to think critically on how these trust relationships are set up in your environment, so that you can kind of foresee what's happening. So as an example, I have a test lab called hotnops.com. And these are all the domains associated with it, right? And it's important to note that with any tenant, you don't have to, like, the domains don't have to just be subdomains of the main TLD, like hotnops.com. You could have like, and this tool right here is called AAD internals. So AAD internals has a page called OSINT, where you, like all this is public information. So go pick a Fortune 50 company and put their website in here, and you'll see like how many like disparate domains there are, right? And just to highlight, like, these are pretty sprawling. And so if we could prove out the fact that a compromise in one could equal a compromise in all, that would be a really big deal, right? Um, so the way that this works, the way that these domains kind of connect to Entra is this thing that they used to call Azure AD Connect. In fact, the binary is still called Azure AD Connect if you download it, but they call it Entra Connect now. And it's actually a really, really interesting kind of neat piece of software that it's like very well engineered in the sense that it has like these very abstract notions of there are these remote directories, whatever they, whether it's Entra or Active Directory, and it kind of ingests all of them and kind of syncs them together, and it acts as like a kind of like a conflict manager, like in Git, you have like it can do like auto conflict management. Entra Connect will kind of project all of these objects into this consolidated space and kind of like keep this single source of truth. And then it figures out how to write everything back out based on what changes, based on these rules. And that's a very heavy handed way to describe this because the way that most people use it is, oh, it syncs my users and my groups and my devices up to Azure, right? Or up to Entra. And for the most part, that's how it's used, right? So you create a user or you create a group on prem, all of a sudden it shows up in Entra. It's this Entra Connect that's doing that work, right? So if we look at a possible setup, and my case, there's a tenant called hotnops.com, right? And we have, just say for the sake of this argument, we have three domains. One's called federated, one's called hybrid, one's called ADFS. And those are all syncing. They have a bidirectional sync. Um, and the question is, what can we do with that from an attacker standpoint, right? So in this case, like I said, in 99% of the use cases is things go up. The question is, do things go down, right? And to understand how that works, whenever you install Entra Connect, you have essentially three accounts that get created. And there's one for on-prem. There's actually two for on-prem. There's one for Entra that like writes and reads to Entra. So if I create a new user, there's an actual cloud-only Entra user that has a specific role that's permitted to do that. And then on premises, you have actually it's insanely privileged because it needs to be able to sync password hashes up into Entra. And so this ADDS connector account actually has DC sync privileges. It can act like a domain controller in that sense and dump out all the password hashes. So from a BloodHound parlance, this is very much a tier 0 asset, right? And so the question is, if we compromise that tier 0 asset in a domain, if we compromise all three of these accounts in a given domain, what can we do? Like what levers can we pull to get access to another domain? And that's really been like the focus of what I've been looking at in the past couple months, right? So this is an example of the sync account for one of my Entra Connects. And you'll see that like when you install Entra Connect, it's going to actually provision a new role in Entra because you authenticate with something very privileged. Often it's a global administrator, but it'll create this account called on-premises directory synchronization service account. And for every time you do this, every time you install an Entra Connect on a different domain that's a part of the same tenant, it's going to install another one of these, right? So you're like, if you have 8 domains and they're all completely physically separate and they have their own Entra Connect, then you're going to have 8 sync accounts, right? And those sync accounts have this role called directory synchronization accounts role. And this is the really kind of important part. These roles are identical, right? There's no difference in privilege between the two, which means that if I compromise the sync account in domain A, I have the same privileges in theory as a sync account in domain B. So the question is, what can we do with that? What is, how can we affect change from one domain to the other? And so, this is my little icon for compromise here. So let's say we compromise federated.hotnops.com. Well, we know that we can read and write to Entra with that sync account, right? The question is, can we write something up into Entra and get that change reflected back down on premises to another domain? So can we like lob it up and have it go back down somewhere else, right? And it turns out that in most cases, that's not true. So there's just a couple things that write back down, but it turns out that we can abuse those, right? And to understand how that works, we have to understand like how like Entra works, and so, or at least some of the basics of how it consolidates data. So as I mentioned, like Entra kind of does this thing where it has a um, kind of like a conflict management space, and that's called the metaverse, right? So the idea is that we have a connector that connects to Active Directory, and we have a connector that connects to Entra, right? And if you remember, there's 3 accounts, and 2 of those were connector accounts. Those connector accounts are responsible for kind of enumerating all the like groups and users in each one of these connected directories, and it imports them into what's called a connector space. And that connector space is kind of like a snapshot of everything you care about in that particular directory. So for the Entra connector, it's going to grab all the users and groups and whatever. It's going to keep that in its own connector space. And then Active Directory on premises is going to do the same. Now, based on some of the rules that we'll take a look at in a minute, it's going to say, you know what? I actually do want to ingest this. I'm going to project this into the metaverse. So, for example, I create a new user in Active Directory. There's a rule saying like, oh, a new user, I do want that to be a part of my like single source of truth in the metaverse. So I will project it, right? And the same thing for Entras. Entra will try to kind of join users from the metaverse, but it actually, if you create a new user in Entra, it will not create one in the metaverse based on the rules. So, and if this isn't making sense, we'll walk through the rules in a second. But all that to say, this metaverse, understanding how things are provisioned in here helps us understand what changes we can affect from a separate domain, right? And we'll see examples of this. So let's hop on over. I'm going to stop screen sharing real quick, and I'm going to share what I have in the lab so that we can kind of walk through it. Okay. So in this lab here, so I have, this is my SCCM domain, and I'll kind of just walk through what kind of what the rules look like, and kind of how this works in general. So in our case, let's just like walk through a provisioning example. So I'm going to go to users here, and I'm just going to create a new user. And I'll just call it test. Test. Let's do webinar. Let's call it webinar test. So we're going to create this user. I'm just going to give it a dummy password for right now. So we have this. Oh, yeah. What's up?
I said super secure.
Yeah. Yeah. Please, no one start guessing at this, because this will get synced up into Entra. So I'm going to have to delete it. So we have this user here, but it's not in Entra yet, right? And in order to do that, we kind of have like this song and dance that happens that you'll notice here. So if you have Entra Connect installed in your environment, you could take a look at this. And so the first thing that happens is every connector runs an import. So we can actually, we could rerun this and take a look at what happened. So this is the act of going out. This is almost like a sharp hound almost. It goes out and it collects all the information about the domain and kind of does a diff and says, oh, some changes happened. I'm going to add it to my connector space. And you'll see that we have an add here in our webinar test. So at this point, we do not have webinar tests in our metaverse yet. So you'll see here, let's search for, in the metaverse, it's called a person, not a user. But we do not have webinar test here yet. And that's by design. So the next thing that would happen typically is that imports would be run for every connector space. So and that would be including Entra as well. So you go out, it's going to go out and reach, pull down all the users from Entra, whatever, and it should say nothing has changed unless something changed automatically, right? So at this point, what we're going to do is run a delta sync, and that's what's going to make the decision to project into our metaverse, right? So if we do another delta sync, um, we'll see. So right now it's thinking, it's saying, okay, what's changed? I'm going to evaluate all my rules. We're going to have a new projection, and that projection is going to be our webinar test, right? Now at this point, remember, webinar test is not in Entra yet, but it is in our metaverse. And that's actually a pretty important distinction. And I'm not going to touch on it too much in this webinar, but there is a possibility of things just sitting in the metaverse without being connected to Entra. And we could also take advantage of that. So I just put out a blog post kind of describing how that happens. And if you're curious, you can go through and check that out as well. But you'll see now that we have our webinar test in our metaverse. And then the last thing that we have to do, oops, is export it. So it's that export step that basically says, okay, here's everything I have in my metaverse. Do I need to write anything out to my connectors? And so in that case, we could run an export specifically on the Entra part. And that's going to say, oh, yeah, I have things in the metaverse that aren't in AAD. And so I'm going to write to that. No, this isn't like hard coded logic at all in Entra Connect. These are all defined by rules. And these are the rules that it's kind of dictating what happens. So in this case, we can kind of walk through step by step of what's going on. So there's this idea of directions. So inbound and outbound. Inbound being into the metaverse and out being from the metaverse to connector spaces. So what we just did, and you'll see here, the export's done. We have an ad. So at this point, Entra should have our webinar test up in the cloud, right? So if we look at user join, this is saying we have a scoping filter here, and this is saying if it's a critical system object or if it has an admin description that starts with user, then don't sync it. Otherwise, ingest it into our connector space, or I'm sorry, in the metaverse. And here's our join rules. The MS consistency GUID in the Active Directory is going to match the source anchor binary in the metaverse. So that's how it's tying connector space objects to metaverse objects. But lastly, and then there's a way to say like, oh, if there's an attribute, I'll actually want to transform it and like rename it or change it. You can do that as well. But this link type here is provision, meaning if it doesn't exist, create it. So it will create a new user in the metaverse when it ingests. And then when we, so that's what happens in our sync. And then our export, you'll see here out to AAD user join is also provision. It's saying provision this in a connector space, and I'm going to put it out there if cloud filtered is not equal to true. If cloud, so like there's all these things that have to be true for it to write out to the connector space so that it can go right out to Entra, right? So having that said, we know that we can, if we compromise like a sync account, we know we can write things up in Entra because it's this sync account, this thing right here, that's writing all these changes. Like I just created a new user and that user got written up in Entra with some account on this box, right? And if we have full control of this domain, then we have those creds. So it stands to reason, yes, we can write new users and we can write new groups and new devices up in Entra. The question is, what can we change from Entra down to on-prem? And to understand that, you see we have these rules called out to AAD. There's also ones called out to AD. And these are the ones that are saying, I'm going to take something from the metaverse Even if it doesn't matter if it was ingested from Active Directory or AAD, it got projected into the metaverse, and I'm going to write it to on-prem. And so what this is saying is, as long as cloud master it's not equal to false, and we're gonna tie up these objects by this unique ID. And by the way, under the hood, it's just the MS SQL database. We're going to join them together. So this just links the objects together. But here's the really interesting one. This is saying that we are going to write this thing called a device key down to MS key credential link, which means if I ingest something called a device key into the metaverse, this will write it back down on-prem. And if you're not familiar with this property, this is what's called like with a log called a shadow credential, right? This can actually be used to authenticate as that user, which is a really big deal because if we can write to this in the cloud, then we can authenticate as this user as it gets synced back down, right? And so there's a very realistic attack path here where if I can like let's say I'm in domain A, let's say we're in this ADFS domain, and I compromise the sync account, um, I can actually write properties up. Now, in this particular case, we that sync account does not get us the privilege to write to the device key, but we do have the privileges to change a password for any user. So what's going to happen is, let's say we change a password for a user that we care about in domain B. Well, let's see how that plays out. We it'll basically write out as a sync account, but that password will never get written down to the on-premises user because there's no rule for just passwords. The only thing that gets written back down is this key, right? So we can actually change a password of any arbitrary user in any domain that's associated with our tenant and authenticate as them. Now, the other kind of caveat for this particular attack path is if they have two-factor, then we need to we'd have to have control of that two-factor, and that's just a product of this particular attack type, like with adding the device key. But I suspect that there are other attack paths, right? So let's say let's go back. So let's say we're in ADFS and we want to compromise a user in SCCM. We could use that sync account to change the password, set the device key, and then that device key gets written back down to our target user on-prem in this domain. So now we're kind of hopping in between domains. And so I do have an example of how that works, but it takes there's some syncing elements happening. So like these syncs happen every half hour. And I didn't kind of want to bore you with just sitting around watching it. So I did it a little bit before the call, or before this webinar. So what happens is in the AD space, I compromised a target user. We have a user in this domain called Dave, and we essentially added a key to Dave. And so you'll see here we run our sync delta import from local. There's no changes. Delta import from on-premises, we have two adds. And when it comes to on-prem, they're all UUIDs, so it's hard to read, right? And you'll see here that this Dave at sccm.hotnops.com had this what's called this searchable device key, and that's the thing that was added. And so this searchable device key is what it's called in the connector space, but it's called the device key in the metaverse. So there's a transformation that says, oh, I'm going to take that thing that's called searchable device key, I'm going to project it as a device key in the metaverse, and then when we sync, you'll see there's a connector with a flow update here. And this is saying, I have an update to my metaverse object, right? And so at that point, it gets projected into the metaverse. And then lastly, we run an export, and the export is that write operation. And you'll see here we have an update. And that update is that's essentially saying I wrote this MSDS key credential link to this user. So we've effectively what's happened is because we compromised a separate domain, we were able to add this credential to a user in a completely unrelated domain, just in the same tenant. And this works because of that trust relationship that the sync accounts have to like change passwords and whatnot. And remember, you don't actually have to compromise the sync account to pull this off. For example, if you just compromise this user's password in two factor, you could do this attack. Now you wouldn't have to because if you have their plain text password, then you can authenticate on prem anyways. Uh, but it will come in handy as we discover like more primitives on like how to abuse these sync mechanisms to be able to like add arbitrary credentials to different principles. Um, so that's really about it. And I have been doing a horrible job looking at the chat questions. Does anyone have any questions about this, or does anyone want me to like dive into a particular spot that I may have glossed over?
This is really cool, Daniel.
Thanks. Yeah, and kind of like I mentioned earlier, like I do believe because of these like kind of loose trust relationships that like there will be more attack primitives that come out of this. Like this will be a consideration, and hopefully something that gets into Bloodhound. So keep an eye on this. If you are an admin, like pay attention to your sync accounts and what's going on there, and keep an ear out for more blog posts about this kind of stuff. Cool. I think that's all for me.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Really cool to
Mhm.
see all that stuff. I mean, there's so much complexity built into those systems that there's all kinds of opportunity for nasty attack paths to show up.
I think anytime there's like two sources of truth, like when there's
Gonna
two
have a
instead
bad
of
time.
one, there's always something to abuse. So yeah,
Yeah,
there'll be more.
cool. I don't see any other questions, so if you don't mind, I'm going to reshare the announcement slide and walk through those real quick, and we'll wrap it up.
All right.
All right, folks. Couple announcements. Again, we've got SoCon coming up here at the end of March into beginning of April. We've got both the conference with a couple days of talks, plus we are offering multiple of our training classes. So go check that out, specterops.io/SoCon. We have a webinar coming up for folks who are in the federal space for our FedRAMP offering of Bloodhound Enterprise. It's a joint offer or a joint webinar with Carasoft, who anybody in that space will certainly be familiar with. We'll be talking about Bloodhound Enterprise and reducing risk from identity attack paths. Um, we also have a survey going on for our Bloodhound CE users. We're looking for more information about things you like, what you don't, how you use the tool, etc. This is going to be helpful to feed into things that we do in the future with the product. We are also going to be attending FSISAC for folks in the financial services industry. Justin Kohler, who's our VP of product, will be presenting with Eric McGuffin from State Street Bank, talking about hybrid identity attack paths. So, if you found Daniel's conversation interesting, you'll probably enjoy that as well. And then finally, our next Bloodhound release recap will be on March 5th. Yes, I know we're skipping the whole month of February, but it's short and there's a lot going on. So looking forward to that. We got some cool stuff coming up in the product that I'm looking forward to share with you all in about a month or so. I don't believe there's any other questions. We answered everything was here. So I'm just going to go ahead and thank everyone for attending. Thanks for joining. Thanks for your time. If you have any other questions, feel free to let us know. The Bloodhound Gang Slack is a great spot to chat with folks and get questions answered. Or if you can go on our SpecterOps.io website, we've got contact buttons and all that good stuff. Thanks again, everyone, and have a lovely rest of your day.